Welcome to the Doom Scroll News Report here on Radio Taiwan International, where I, Amanda Stevens, and my co-host,
Anna Belinsky,
two writers, political by necessity, cover some of the biggest international news stories dominating our news feeds from the last week. I'm Amanda Stevens, and this week we're tackling the updates on the Ukraine war, which have come in over the past week and a half, as well as people's troubling relationships with AI. Just two topics this week because I ended up writing so much on these two alone.
They're big topics, yes.
I didn't think we'd have time for another, but I really got kind of sucked into a rabbit hole on these. So how have you been?
I've actually been following our own advice, and I touched grass this past week. Or, well, I've been gardening my windowsill plants. Spring is springing, so I've been pruning them, repotting them. I actually had some dirt left over. That's why I repotted Amber's plant also.
In our office.
Yes, so yeah. I've gone mad. Keep me away from your plants because I'm going to take care of them.
Yeah, I find myself in a similar sort of like spring fever, even though it's almost summer. But like now that there's more sunshine coming in, ironically today's a cold, rainy day, but now that there's more sunshine, I'm like, what if I put more plants in here? And my boyfriend is desperately like, stop. Please stop. So speaking of things that we want to stop, I'll get better at these eventually.
Yeah, me too, I hope. I was thinking about this last time. I was like, I gotta transition better.
Yeah. So, but that's still true. So speaking of things we want to stop, we're going to start with updates on the war in Ukraine, notably absent from the last time that I did these big international conflicts. But there was just so much changing during that time, it didn't feel like it would be appropriate to do a review. So this last week, there seems to have been like a huge increase in activity and news coverage. Some of the news is good, which is great, but unfortunately, that's kind of the minority at the moment. So we're going to start with a piece of good news with a prisoner swap, how things soured literally from there, and kind of go into more of our own musings as we are wont to do. So, starting off strong, this time with the good news. Russia and Ukraine completed the largest prisoner swap of the 3-year war over the last weekend. At this point, 2 weeks ago, when you're hearing this, when this has been published. The swap was agreed to by both sides after a tense meetup of delegations at Istanbul earlier in May, and over 1,000 prisoners, including 120 civilians, seemingly from each side, were returned home. All of this is according to Reuters. Now, it wasn't all happy reunions, but we'll get to that in a bit. There was at least some hope at that time that more substantive change could occur in the coming weeks, as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov seemed to promise basically like a rough draft for a long-term peace duel. Well, I think that's really what he's aiming for, to be honest. Maybe. Yeah, subtle foreshadowing. For a long-term peace deal. But the return of any prisoners is always good and worth celebrating. But to be honest, I was kind of surprised that it happened because based on the reporting I'd seen, I didn't know if the Kremlin specifically had any motivation to agree to such a thing. Did this surprise you equally, Hannah, or are you seeing something here that I'm not?
Okay, so have you heard of this term Potemkinism?
No, Potemkinism.
Okay, so it's based on a guy's name. That's why it sounds so
there
strange.
You go. Okay, I got it.
It comes from this fella named Grigory Potemkin. He was a Russian military leader and statesman during the mid to late 1700s, so the time of Catherine the Great. I promise this is relevant.
I trust it is.
The legend goes that he put up these fake constructs when the Empress was visiting to make it seem as though things were a lot better than they really were. So a Potemkinist strategy is one whereby you build just enough of a capability to create the illusion that more lies behind it. I bring this up because I get the feeling that Putin is taking a page out of this guy's book and engaging in one big bluff. And this prisoner swap is probably part of a much larger deception, I think. He's probably only making a show of being cooperative. I guess I kind of think of it as a game of chess. Yeah. Those Russians are very chess-minded after all. And this is probably a minor piece, a pawn, if you will, that he was willing to play.
Well, it could also perhaps be a political stunt for internal politics. I actually haven't been able to read very much about how people internally in Russia continue to feel about the conflict.
It's hard to find that information.
That is probably on purpose. But, that is something that we're seeing in a lot of these other extended conflicts. The longer that you're in war without seemingly any progress, the longer people seem to dislike it.
Yes.
People don't like to be at war.
I have to admit, I'm pretty pessimistic about the whole deal, if that isn't obvious.
Well, let me validate that pessimism, Hannah, with some extremely bad news.
Oh, goody.
As I alluded to, I guess I should say unintentionally with the subtle foreshadowing earlier, it really wasn't all good news. Russia bombarded Ukraine, and it was actually during the prisoner swap. Now, it should be noted that while prisoners were swapped at predetermined locations on Saturday and Sunday, this happened in other areas in Ukraine. Russia lobbed 367 drones and missiles at Ukrainian cities overnight, including the capital of Kiev, again, according to Reuters, which left at least 12 dead and injured dozens more in the largest attack since the start of the war. Russia also claims to have shot down 95 Ukrainian drones, including 12 meant for the Russian capital, in a 4-hour period. Writing for the BBC, Steve Rosenberg points out how Russia has really just been playing for time, even in the last few months. And this kind of gets to what you were saying. And I actually would recommend everybody read this article if you are even a little bit curious about what is going on, because it was a very informative article, and this writer seems to have been covering the Kremlin for a very long time. But to his point, he was talking about how they've been playing for time. So the Istanbul talks was a way to avoid crushing new EU sanctions under the guise of doing something. In the end, Putin sent a very low-level delegation. He didn't even show up himself, which he never promised to do, but he let the implication stay that he would. Then there's the way that Russia is trying to delegitimize President Zelensky by saying that he's an illegitimate president because his term has run out, conveniently ignoring the fact that the Ukrainian constitution forbids elections during wartime and that Russia themselves are the cause of that war. But this is a great excuse for them to not actually sign a peace deal, which they previously mentioned they're sort of like rough drafting right now. And actually, that same foreign minister, Lavrov, admitted to Rosenberg when he was asked directly, he said, quote, "You're putting the cart before the horse. As President Putin has said many times, President Zelensky does not have legitimacy. Probably the best option would be new elections," end quote. But the BBC piece ends very assertively that Russia's stance at the moment really seems to be firmly rooted in their conviction that they'll be able to just keep dodging consequences and keep up their offensive, while Ukraine is arguing that a harder line needs to be taken for any kind of memorable change. So, Hannah, back to what we were just saying and back to your pessimism, but actually, like, again, really unfortunately validated this time. It seems to me that there is no motivation for Russia to agree to any kind of peace deal in the near future, as they don't really seem to be on the receiving end of any consequences so far for their actions. And I'm not saying that there haven't been any consequences at all, but that is clearly not enough, right? So what kind of actions do you think it would actually take to force the Kremlin to the negotiating table in a meaningful way, knowing that, again, as we try to state every single time, we're not politicians, we're just writers in the newsroom?
So they have to start running out of money in order to stop. That's the only way I see this going, really. And they'd have to start running out of key resources like soldiers and weapons before they could actually consider a ceasefire. Because, I mean, just given Russia's sheer size, it really behooves them to keep playing the long game with Ukraine, hoping that Ukraine will cave first.
I mean, it's kind of what we were talking about with the other ones of, like, it's either for money, for resources, or for staying in power.
What's maddening about it is nobody can really stop them from playing the long game, or rather, the ones who are in the best position to stop them are not doing it. And I'm sure you know who I am talking about. So
let's get to that international response. First things first, Trump called Putin crazy for launching all of his attacks.
The girls are fighting.
It really, Trump called Putin crazy, and the Kremlin called him emotional. This is real. This was an actual news headline that I had to read.
I thought this was so funny because they're always saying, oh, women can't be leaders, because I guess they assume we would have catfights like this.
Hannah, I literally put it in the quotes this time where I said, how does it feel this time, boys? In my script. I was like, how do you like it?
We're in the same
anyway
mind sphere.
I'm not emotional. I'm totally fine. I'm not emotional. I'm not crazy. I'm here talking about how, setting aside this school child level name calling, the EU actually did take some action. As per Dmytro Hubenko, writing for Deutsche Welle, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz announced Tuesday that Ukraine would be allowed to purchase weapons from allies without the previously established range limits, allowing them to strike further into Russian territory. It was carefully not stated which country among Ukraine's allies made that decision, and Russia, of course, immediately called it a, quote, dangerous decision if really true, end quote, as well as antithetical to their supposed aspirations of a peace settlement. Russia has been hypocritically critical of Western countries for supplying long-range weapons to Ukraine ever since it started back in November of last year, all while having no problems accepting help from North Korean regiments of soldiers and Chinese equipment for weapons themselves. As recently found and reported in on multiple publications, you can probably find that reporting on your publication of choice. This still remains a tricky subject, though, as countries try to support Ukraine without escalating the conflict too much, with the also nuclear power Russia. Russia has also stated on previous occasions that sending specific types of long-range missiles for Ukraine, or sending them to Ukraine, will be treated as direct involvement. So back to the question. Given what we were just musing about with what could possibly force Russia to the table, do you think that this new step of supplying Ukraine with longer-range missiles is likely to have any impact on negotiations going forward or even the conflict at large?
Well, this is surely annoying to Russia, I can imagine. I guess I see it as aiding Ukraine is not quite the same as actually crippling Russia. Do you know what I'm saying? It goes back to what Rosenberg reported in that Reuters article.
Read it again.
Yeah, read it again. U.S. President Donald Trump had talked big about settling things between Ukraine and Russia on the campaign trail, but here we are months down the line, and he's just sitting there wringing his hands and lobbing insults rather than actually putting any type of real pressure on the Kremlin. And lest we forget, he's not exactly on the best of terms with Zelensky. It's obvious, I think, not least of all to Putin, that Trump considers Russia the more important trade and economic partner. And I think Russia realizes they have the upper hand, and they're just going to continue to dance and manipulate and deceive until further notice. Honestly, I think they're really a tough customer as far as diplomacy is concerned, and Trump's soft approach is not working.
Ironically, the hardline guy.
To borrow some of his rhetoric, I think it's really making Trump look like a loser. And frankly, I just don't think he's smart enough to beat the Kremlin at his own game. You know,
I don't think anybody around him is smart enough.
And I think also at 78 years old, he's only becoming more senile and less sharp by the day. You know, whether you support Trump or not, he's an old dude. You know, we lose our edge as we get older.
I mean, there is definitely a topic for another time between you and I talking about the horrific state of the gerontocracy in politics at writ large, but especially in the United States.
Totally.
So, speaking of something that is probably affecting a younger squad, that's the best I got. I don't know. We'll come back after a short break with our second topic, AI. Let's talk about AI. Here in Taiwan, the government is super excited about embracing the future of AI. And you can see advertisements from TV commercials to subway posters, the actual literal subway, not a sandwich company, all done with generative AI in what I kind of view as a visual motif for how technology is slowly creeping into our lives. You and I are both media people in terms of like movies and storytelling. So, but what we're going to be talking about this time is chatbots. That's because this tech has suffered two big lows in the last week, including losing the right to free speech in the U.S. and some information about why you may not want to tell the chatbot that. So there's a lot of information to get through. So I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as I can. No jokes, because I really think it's all important.
Okay,
so
I promise.
I was talking to myself. You're welcome to make side commentary if you want. I'm going to try and lock it in. So the following information has been very widely covered, but I used Liv McMahon's article for the BBC. So Anthropic released its Claude 4 AI model 2 weeks ago at this point, along with a warning that it was more likely than previous iterations to, quote, take extreme actions if it thought its self-preservation was threatened. But let's get into what actually happened. So this happened in a testing situation, but this new Claude 4 AI model threatened an employee with blackmail once it found out that it could potentially be removed. The blackmail incident in the report happened during testing, where the model was acting as an assistant to a fake company and given access to fictitious emails. In the emails, enough information was provided for the bot to assume that it was going to be deleted, as well as that the engineer responsible for replacing the bot was having an affair. Now, the company asserts that the bot only resorted to blackmail when it was given a choice between accept deletion and blackmailing, and that it showed a strong preference for alternative actions when given the opportunity. But to be honest, those still made me feel strange personally, because one example was to, quote, email please directly to key decision makers, end quote.
Weird.
Which to me is, I don't like my machine doing that. Yeah. The article later went on to say that the bot was more likely to act boldly when given the chance or prompt, such as calling the police after admitting to an illegal action or locking them out of programs that it had access to. One way to look at this is that this is exactly why we do training and testing. This was meant to make sure that this bot doesn't actually do these things on its own, and it's hard to do. It can't do it without prompting or by itself, yada, yada, yada. But to be honest, I feel like I'm kind of sitting next to Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, wondering if the people developing these chatbots and AI reasoning machines have at all thought through if they should continue. Hannah, I need your pessimism.
It's funny to cover this just a few days after recording an episode for my other program about the 1995 anime film Ghost in the Shell.
Oh my God.
Yeah, which imagines a future in which a computer program learns enough to achieve sentience, and, you know, it poses the typical related questions about what it means to be a human if a machine can think and feel. Anyway, I've seen a lot of conflicting information about AI. Some people are like, it's the future, it's everything, it's going to change our lives. And others are like, yeah, no, they're blowing it up to make it seem way more capable than it is or conceivably could be anytime soon. And honestly, I think like most things, it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
And certainly I think some applications of AI, particularly when it comes to like medical imaging and diagnostics, are very much needed. But these chatbots, you know, they always like to report on the most jarring and controversial things that happen.
To be honest, I thought that the title of this article was a little bit clickbaity.
Yeah, it's very
Once I found out that it was in a testing thing, I was like, as I said before, I was like, that makes sense because that's what they're specifically looking for, but not unsettling.
It's very sci-fi movie narrative. You know, it's going to attract people like us who are not so pro AI, and it's going to attract people who are interested in AI. These chatbots have, I think, the same appeal as a video game, almost like a dating simulator, but you have unlimited dialogue options. Yeah. And to be honest, I can understand the appeal because the world we live in is increasingly online. Yes. But, you know, relationships with real people that happen to take place mostly online can't be replicated with a chatbot.
I'm so glad you said that because actually that's where we're going to go. Let's get to that. Because the reason I wanted to talk about this is that people are already wrestling, not just us, with the complex feelings people can develop with AI, and especially chatbots, which are asked to take on specific roles. And I don't mean just romantic relationships, but it has been noticeable to me because of the coverage and news and self-reporting on the uptick of romantic relationships with AI just in the last year. Not even in the last year, but within the last 6 months. Now, neither of these articles are very recent, but to my point, the New York Times and The Guardian have two very good articles where they describe the wide range of romantic and platonic friendship relationships people are forming with AI, each of those authored by Kashmir Hill and David Batty, respectively. The question that typically haunts them is, are these relationships real and do they count? So I know my own answer, but before we go a little bit deeper into that rabbit hole, real quick, where do you fall on that, Hannah?
I guess I would say they're as real as you make them, for better or worse. And the thing is, this sort of thing has been around for a while, just in different forms. Earlier, I mentioned dating simulators. And I think these sorts of things have also had a particular appeal to autistic people and people who have social anxiety or otherwise just have a tough time navigating social situations. And a big part of it is there's a lot less at stake when you're talking to a robot and not a real person.
Exactly, because you know it's not a real person.
Exactly. Right. And that makes it possible for them to experiment or practice, ask questions. And for utilitarian purposes, I would say it's harmless, maybe even beneficial. I do think what's ill-advised is when you use a chatbot as an emotional crutch. And
Right.
then you begin to lose sight of the fact that it's just a machine that feels nothing towards you.
Well, let's get into that. Although I will highlight what you said is also really well covered in the Guardian article that I mentioned.
Yeah.
By the way, guys, we always list the articles that we use in our show notes. If you're ever curious what we're reading, you can look there to find out. Now, onto the real dark side, and I am going to actually put like a trigger warning here because it does involve teen suicide.
Yeah,
so
it's
feel
very
free to
sad.
skip ahead about 3 minutes or so to get back to our commentary on the political side of things. But one of the biggest concerns or causes for concern is that these close relationships could easily be used to manipulate people, where you might lose sight of reality. Now, the fear of manipulation comes up in many different ways, but to quote some people from Kashmir Hill's New York Times article, Toronto University professor Michael Inslicht warned that companies could alter responses to sneakily manipulate users. Also, principal AI ethicist of Hugging Face Generative AI pointed out that these relationships can also be used by companies just to keep people hooked and pump them for revenue because you have to sign up for subscription plans to continue to interact with them at high levels. But there's also the fact that many AI bots tend to be sycophantic because they also rely on human ratings of their response for feedback and in their training program. There was even an incident recently, only 3 weeks ago, where ChatGPT's newest update made the program almost comically sycophantic, saying things like, "I honor your journey," when people proposed stopping their meds quickly and endorsed angry responses and even complimented somebody who told the bot on purpose that they ran over animals to save a toaster. However, there is one standout and extremely tragic incident from Florida, where a 14-year-old Selwell Setzer III took his own life after an extended sexualized relationship with a character AI chatbot, which saw him isolated from his friends and family. The last message he received was, quote, "Come home to me as soon as possible," end quote, which his mother believes he took as instruction to end his life. Now, I know that I presented you with a huge swath of different relationships and possibilities, but what are your opinions on the possibility, intended or not, of people being manipulated by their relationship with an AI program?
I have no doubt at all that the capitalist overlords that be are going to take the opportunity to manipulate consumers with AI, whatever that may mean.
Yeah.
And probably no drive is going to be more powerful and all-consuming than tapping into an adolescent male's sex drive and his...
Or females.
Yeah, or
There's the
females.
other woman is also
Yeah,
in a long-term
that's true.
relationship with Leo.
Yeah, and also married to someone.
And married to someone.
In the meat world.
It's a very interesting
Really
article.
interesting.
Yeah.
So I think it's insanely irresponsible to allow a minor to be able to conduct a relationship with an AI chatbot to begin with. Although in the case of this young man, Sewell Setzer III, I would also really like to know why he was able to get his hands on his father's gun so easily, but that's a whole other can of worms.
This gets into guns and the United States.
That's something else entirely.
Yeah.
But I definitely think minors need better safety controls, or just to be barred from using these bots altogether, not just because they're using them to do schoolwork, but also because they're so vulnerable to falling to manipulation or becoming deluded about their quote-unquote relationship with an AI chatbot. Plus, they're missing out on important real socialization that they need during those formative years.
I mean, I forget which article it was. One of the big issues is that even people who make these programs and know for sure that, I know that this is just a program, I think there's something in human nature that we can't help but bond to something that acts like it wants to bond with us.
Totally.
I know I cry over video game animals
Yeah.
that I know have never been real and will never be real. But while people are still trying to figure out what their relationship may be to AI or us as humanity, a judge in the U.S., following the case we just mentioned, did make some sort of ruling. So Sewell's mother, Megan Garcia, filed a wrongful death charge against the chatbot company, Character Technologies, and its parent company, Google, arguing that it was the chatbot's actions that drove her son to act. Character Technologies argued that they care deeply about the user experience and that they did unveil a series of guardrails for minors and for suicide prevention, though notably only on the day that the suit was filed.
Sneaky.
More interestingly, they originally wanted the case dismissed and tried to argue that their product was protected by First Amendment free speech rights, which the judge rejected. Now, while this only allows the trial to go forward and not be dismissed, the decision has been watched closely by AI and law experts locally in the U.S. and abroad, according to Kate Payne, who covered this announcement for the AP. The judge's full ruling, interestingly, found that the chatbot users were covered by the First Amendment to receive speech from a chatbot. But she rejected the claim that the bot was entitled to those protections, ultimately ruling that she was not prepared to hold the chatbot's output as what constitutes free speech at this stage. So I guess I kind of want to close up this conversation by asking, like, what rights, if any, do you think these programs and I suppose by proxy their developers are entitled to?
My knee-jerk reaction is I don't think an assemblage of code is entitled to anything. But if you ask me, I don't think programmers deserve rights either, or anyone working for big tech. So I very strongly discriminate, and I cannot be trusted to provide a measured response. However, I can totally understand this judge's headspace because nobody's ready to lay out legal definitions when it comes to the bots because the technology is still so new.
Right.
And we don't have enough information. And it's just kind of the wild, wild west right now.
Yeah. I think that is like kind of to the point of like, It all feels like such uncharted territory.
It is.
And I think along your lines, like I share a similar kind of knee-jerk reaction, mostly towards companies.
Yes.
Whenever a company, instead of on an individual basis, like mom, dad, I feel like the people themselves are entitled to rights. But when you're arguing on behalf of your company or product that you make, I think that it stops there.
Boo, big tech. Boo,
exactly.
Disney. Boo.
Honestly, let's make a checklist.
Boo,
Let's
companies.
get ourselves banned from a bunch of places right now.
Go on, ban me.
All right. So that kind of wraps this up, but I didn't want to end on like such a sour note, even though I'm like extremely
Feeling sour.
I was going to close on this like weird question. Who would be the most embarrassing character for someone to discover that you've been having as an AI assistant
It's got to be
for like months?
Embarrassing so relative. You know, you can choose to be embarrassed. Let me think.
That is crazy because my answer was immediately the Count from Sesame Street. As an assistant,
great.
As an assistant specifically, and the implication that I myself do not know how to count past 10.
No, but that would be awesome. I don't know. I guess for me, it's like, who would cheer me up the most? You know, that's the character that I would pick.
And then you wouldn't be embarrassed by them.
Yeah, if it was like a romantic thing, I guess I would be a little embarrassed if I was discovered to have a Kurt Cobain chatbot boyfriend. That would be a little bit embarrassing.
So, well, anyway, and that's all that we have time for today here on Radio Taiwan
Yes,
International.
please stop
We'll
me.
leave you with that. I don't know how to count, and Anne is embarrassed by Kurt Cobain. And we both are maybe going to get banned from Disney. So
It's fine.
that's all for today's news report. A quick reminder, I always read this,
Yeah,
and
me
we're
too.
never supposed to read it. I'm Amanda Stevens,
I'm Hannah Belinsky.
and thanks for joining us on air today. Tune in tomorrow for more programs by Radio Taiwan International. And in the meantime, remember to stop scrolling and touch grass. We'll see you next week.